Hi everyone, welcome back to the Slasher Studies Summer Camp, an international conference on slasher theory, history and practice. With my apologies for the hiccup whilst I was wrapping up before the break, we are indeed convening at 3 and not 3:30, so I hope as many of you gathered it was a slip up and are here. So this brings me to introduce our third panel of the day, which is called Redefining Whiteness in American Slasher. This panel is going to be chaired by Dr. Catherine Lester, who's at the University of Birmingham. So I will now pass over to Kat.
Hello. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be chairing this panel today on redefining whiteness in the American slasher. And as with the other panels so far today, we will hear from each of our presenters in turn. You are all very welcome to post questions and comments in the chat section on YouTube, and I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the papers and picking out questions that we can respond to in the Q&A at the end. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Kaylee Simmons holds a PhD in English from the University of California, Riverside, and she is an assistant professor of Indigenous Nation Studies at Portland State University. An Indigenous feminist scholar of Oglala Dakota descent, her work examines depictions of North American Native peoples in film and literature, with an emphasis on the genres of horror and speculative fiction. Her research has appeared in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, and she has an essay on horror and Indigenous representation forthcoming in the journal Science Fiction, Film and Television. And she's here to speak to us about The Ones Who Did Not Die, Captivity, Narratives, and Final Girls. Take it away.
Thank you. All right, let me get my screen shared and then we'll get it going. Okay, so before I start, there's nothing on the screen because I'm just going to talk. So before I begin, I'm speaking to you from the United States, which is a settler state. So I want to acknowledge specifically that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah Califlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, and also the Tualatin Kalapuya, who, among with many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River, are the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air. And so I ask that you, all of you, please take a moment to acknowledge and reflect on the native, Aboriginal, and indigenous peoples of the area from where you are physically joining us today. And if you're not familiar, please take the time to self-educate, to reflect, to listen to these histories of these indigenous peoples, as these small acts are part of the justice-oriented advocacy necessary for continuing the work of dismantling the devastating effects of settler colonialism in our societies today and in our various nations. So with that, I'll jump into the presentation. So according to Carol Clover, horror's final girl challenges the gendered conventions of cinema because, quote, the gaze becomes, at least for a while, female, end quote. The final girl's apprehension of the gaze does not lead to her punishment, but is actually an essential step leading to her victory over the monster. The repeated representation of a heroic female lead who outlasts her male peers for Clover would, quote, seem to suggest at least one of the traditional marks of heroism, triumphant self-rescue, is no longer strictly gendered masculine, end quote. And as such, the figure of the final girl marks a notable departure for Clover from conventional representations of women in cinema and literature. But a look into literary history reveals that slasher films are not the first genre to invite male audience members to identify with the suffering and experiences of a female protagonist. The Puritan woman of the Captivity narrative is also able to function as a witness subject who can attest to her own experiences of suffering and survival amongst indigenous peoples. Thus, in the Captivity narrative and in the slasher, there is what Clover calls a, quote, exposed invitation, end quote, for a male reader to identify with and center the female protagonist's experiences. And so in this talk, I placed two representations of suffering women in productive friction in order to expose the fault lines within American settler colonialism's racial and gendered schemas. I bring the titular character of Mary Rowlandson from a narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Miss Mary Rowlandson, also known as the Sovereignty and Goodness of God, in conversation with critical readings of popular final girl characters like Laurie Strode, in order to argue that there is a troubling resonance between both archetypes. In both genres, the figure of the suffering white woman is afforded a partial, generic, unmarked, and therefore universal form of subjectivity through the acquisition of a distinctly colonial knowing gaze, which justifies violence against people seen as inhuman or abject. In the slasher, the final girl uses her knowledge of the killer to defeat them, and in the Captivity narrative, it is indigenous peoples who must be eliminated. While final girl characters have been lauded for the ways that they destabilize Western gender and subject-object binaries by enabling women, and notably mostly white women, to temporarily inhabit forms of heroic agential subjectivity, which are usually reserved for white men. But the horror associated with possible acts of trespass committed by or upon the figures of the final girl and the woman in Captivity shows that these figures continue to serve key boundary-making functions within the colonial imaginary. So let's start with Mary Rowlandson. So a narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Mary Rowlandson is the first and most famous Captivity narrative in American literary history. In the text, Rowlandson recalls the 11 weeks and 5 days she spent as a captive of the Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Pokanoket peoples, who at the time had allied together against Puritan colonists in the midst of King Philip's War. The text consists of two parts. First, there is a brief introduction to Rowlandson and her text offered by Per Amicum, which translates to by a friend, but which most scholars of Rowlandson agree was most likely penned by Reverend Increase Mather, a member of the Puritan clergy, and also notable for his participation in the Salem witch trials. Following Per Amicum's introduction is the body of Rowlandson's text, which is broken up into 20 parts, which are called removes, in reference to Rowlandson's movement further into indigenous territories throughout the narrative. So scholars continue to debate the ways the text might have been mediated by the men in Rowlandson's life, specifically the degree to which Increase Mather shaped the story's final form. And this is like a whole other can of worms that I'm glad to talk about in Q&A some more. But I'll leave that question up in the air for now. Although, it is immediately apparent that the preface itself largely functions as a way for the text audience, which at its initial publication would have been primarily men, to make sense of the narrative and its author. So to give a little bit of background too about Puritans and how weird they are, Per Amicum's preface is a performance of what is called Puritan typology, which is a mode of interpreting scripture and all of history. It's a way of reading the world, basically. So typology was premised on the assumption that all instances of providence in the present, so instances of miracles or good things that happened to you, or bad things even, were reoccurrences of events of the Bible. So not only was typology a way for Puritans to understand that the New Testament was repetitions of things that was foretold in the Old Testament, but it also allowed them to interpret all of the events of their everyday lives as repetitions of biblical precedents. Increase Mather, aka Per Amicum, would at times go so far as to describe the settlement of the New England colonies as the literal recreation of paradise on earth as foretold in scripture. So we see this kind of typological reading appearing throughout Per Amicum's preface to Rowlandson's text. For example, he states that Rowlandson's experiences, quote, doth bear some resemblance to those of Joseph, David, and Daniel, yea, and of the three children too, the stories whereof do represent us with the excellent textures of divine providence. And thus, what he's implying is that Rowlandson's narrative is a repetition of the biblical experiences of the prophets. The resonances between Rowlandson's experiences and the biblical precedents thus requires that they be shared publicly. And Per Amicum even goes so far as to describe the narrative as, quote, a dispensation of public note and of universal concernment, worthy to be exhibited to and pondered by all. However, I want to pause here. I'm sort of obsessed with this word dispensation that appears all over Per Amicum's preface, because it has this really it's a really weighted word with all these contradictory meanings that I think are my interest in them will become apparent as I proceed. So theologically, the word dispensation refers to a period of time during which man is tested in respect of obedience to some specific revelation of the will of God. But legally, a dispensation also refers to an exemption from a set of rules or expectations. So it's a repetition and it's an exception. And Rowlandson's narrative appears to be both. And so throughout the entirety of his preface, Per Amicum has to grapple with the fact that Rowlandson's narrative is deeply unusual, having been experienced and penned by a woman. However, its utility, both in providing evidence of the providence of God and of indigenous savagery, seems to outweigh Rowlandson's temporary breach of gender roles. And so in rhetorical drag, Lorraine Carroll agrees that these acts of textual mediation, like those that we see in Per Amicum's preface, were an attempt to control the threatening subjective status of the woman in captivity. And she writes, quote, "The rhetorical construction of the female captive as both subject and object of her text is unstable. The long tradition of viewing women's bodies as objects subverts or destabilizes the authority of the captive woman's expression, her voice of experience. That is, her subject position is always threatened by her object position." And thus, while captivity narratives served a valuable ideological purpose in that they could be used as evidence of indigenous inhumanity and therefore justify morally the genocide of Native nations, they threatened to deconstruct colonial gender hierarchies of the process. And so remember, when Increase Mather claimed, that New England colonies were the sort of recreation of heaven on earth. Well, such a reading simultaneously recasts indigenous resistance within a Puritan and historic spiritual telos, with indigenous peoples embodying, literally the forces of Satan. And it's this understanding of indigenous peoples that would, again, then help the Puritans to justify colonization. Rowlandson herself, through the course of her activity, would learn to master the very mode of reading proposed by Increase Mather. So we get this mode of typology in the introduction, in the preface, and then Rowlandson, in the body of the text itself, proceeds to apply this typological reading to indigenous peoples as well. Puritan colonial expansion posed a serious threat, so this mode of reading that Rowlandson deploys and will learn to master, which is again proposed by Increase Mather, would be a sort of way to help stabilize the sort of threat that her female subjectivity posed. So in the opening scene of the text, there's this raid on Lancaster, which happens before she's taken into captivity. And the way that she describes the raid on Lancaster, she immediately reads indigenous peoples as, of course, heathens, but who embody the sort of physical and spiritual threat, but she also animalizes them. And so she says, quote, "It was a solemn sight to see so many Christians lying in their blood, some here and some here, like a company of sheep torn by wolves." And so again, such language not only animalizes her soon-to-be captors, but it also figures the Lancaster community within the sort of familiar biblical image of the flock. So Rowlandson invokes biblical verse several times throughout her description of the raid, also most notably citing a passage from the book of Job, wherein raiders attack and steal livestock, killing Job's servants, and then leaving only one survivor. And so here Rowlandson echoes the words of the lone survivor. She says, quote, I only am escaped to tell the news." And so again, in all of these sort of references to biblical scripture, Rowlandson thus performs a typological containment of indigenous resistance to colonialism by reading it within the conventions of biblical precedents, and thus sort of diffusing the threat her captors posed to her, because in the Bible it all worked out, and therefore this interaction with indigenous peoples is therefore also predestined to work out. So at one point, also during her captivity, Rowlandson is given a copy of the Bible by her captors and immediately recalls how she returns to the text for guidance. And she says, quote, "I took the Bible, and in that melancholy time, it came into my mind to read the first 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. I found there was mercy promised again, if we would return to him by repentance, and though we were scattered from one end of the earth to the other, yet the Lord would gather us together and turn all of those curses upon our enemies. So again, in her typological superimposition of Deuteronomy onto her own experiences, Roland sees her own redemption and return as sort of biblically foretold. Although in the moment she remains scattered and transported from one end of the earth to the other through her series of removes, the guarantee that typology offers Rowlandson allows her to diffuse these sort of feelings of terror, as God would someday again, turn all of those curses they inflicted upon Rowlandson back onto her captors. So why am I talking about Mary Rowlandson at a slasher conference? What significance do these phenomena in early colonial captivity narratives have for those of us interested in the critical analysis of slasher films? Well, one way we can sort of summarize how Rowlandson arrives at her sort of hero survivor status is through these terms. Rowlandson is invited to apprehend and master a colonial form of looking, typology, that affirms white racial supremacy and patriarchy. So it's about like white men are in charge of everything, right? So by mastering this sort of typological gaze, Rowlandson was able to claim that she knew that she could escape danger, return to her family safely, and that her indigenous captors would soon sort of face God's wrath, right? Rowlandson explains that her salvation comes not from rejecting colonial modes of looking, but by subjecting indigenous peoples to the very same colonial and patriarchal gaze, which places gendered limitations upon Puritan women. And a similar sequence of events occurs within the slasher, wherein the final girl is first objectified by the killer/monster, and the camera, like, if we're thinking about the gaze and Laura Mulvey and all that stuff. So she's objectified by this gaze, only to later then master that same objectifying gaze and then use it to find liberation. So again, to go back to Carol Clover, she explains, quote, "At the level of the cinematic apparatus, the final girl's unfemininity is signaled clearly by her exercise of an active investigating gaze, normally reserved for males and punished in females when they assume it themselves, tentatively at first and then aggressively. The final girl looks for the killer, even tracking him to his forest hut or his underground labyrinth, and then at him kills him, therewith bringing him, often for the first time, into our vision as well. So while the final girl breaks gendered norms through her apprehension of the gaze, this breach is allowed only so long as, in exchange, the destruction of this sort of inhuman and deeply threatening monster occurs. So it's also critical to note that the final girl frequently operates within a constrained relationship to her sexuality if she's able to gain access to the gaze. In his essay, quote, "Proposing a Stronger Model of Feminism in Slasher Cinema," Kyle Christensen agrees with Carol Clover that the final girl is, quote, "not an inherently feminist figure." I think many of us can probably agree with that. And he supports this claim through an analysis of Laurie Strode from John Carpenter's Halloween, who is often sort of extolled as the sort of typical final girl. Although Laurie Strode has been championed as a feminist figure, Christensen argues that rather than displaying the qualities of a liberated and agential woman, Laurie is, quote, "extremely pure and virginal." She's, quote, "very much concerned about appearing upstanding and moral." She's, quote, "submissive." She's domesticated, using babysitting, thus surrogate motherhood, as her chief means of disposable income. So all of those are from Christensen's essay. So thus, according to Christensen, Laurie's ability to fight off the monstrous Michael Myers is a direct result of her alignments with conservative notions of femininity, not despite them. So long as Laurie remains within the confines of a womanhood that is virginal, pure, and domestic, she can experience the narrative agency, which is usually only made available to male characters. This mirrors what we see in a narrative of the restoration of Miss Mary Rowlandson, where an access to a subject-forming discourse comes in exchange for a strict adherence to religious piety and affirmations of anti-Indigenous rhetoric. So in Rowlandson's narrative, the apprehension of a patriarchally sanctioned form of looking and reading both protects the female protagonist from overstepping these sort of barriers of propriety, and it contains her acts of witnessing within a sort of colonial acceptable epistemology. So in both the slasher and the captivity narrative, it's this kind of exchange that takes place that I'm really interested in and trying to sort of bring attention to. So the female protagonist is given access to masculine forms of looking and knowing in return for affirming the very modes of looking and knowing which otherwise constrain her agency. Women are allowed to look and to know so long as they look and know in the way men do. And it's worth pausing to point out the sort of elephant in the room, which is that final girl characters like the protagonists of captivity narratives are almost exclusively white women. And that killers or monsters in both genres are either often sort of racialized peoples or people that are associated, or beings that are associated with a sort of regressed form of civility or humanity, which sort of codes them racially. So given that the modern slasher and the captivity narrative share many parallels in this sort of like parallel narrative structure, it's time to consider how sort of deeply the colonial residue of the captivity narrative still runs within the slasher genre. So Caribbean scholar Sylvia Wynter has critiqued a strain of thinking within Western humanism, which she calls the overrepresentation of man, because this strain of sort of Western humanism treats the white, able-bodied, cisgendered, and heterosexual man, quote, as if it were the human. So thereby, what happens is that all other forms of being, looking, and thinking are subordinated because they don't resemble sort of this man, this prototypical man. So both the captivity narrative and the final girl narratives, like Halloween, contribute to this overrepresentation of man because they have women characters aspire to master masculine and white supremacist forms of looking. They're saying this is the only way to possibly look. So because of this tendency, these narratives unfortunately rather affirm rather than deconstruct patriarchal and colonial hierarchies, despite the ways that they may sort of upset the conventions of audience identification. So what my reading of slashers alongside the captivity narrative hopes to provoke is a discussion of how both race and gender intersect in the horror narrative. The failure to theorize how the pervasive whiteness of the final girl archetype shapes the political meaning of slashers has produced an incomplete understanding of how whiteness, gender, and racialized difference manifest to shape forms of looking. If debates about the feminist critical potential of the final girl are to continue, I think that scholars must seriously consider why it is that the figure's whiteness has not been theorized quite so thoroughly as her femininity. That's it. That's all I gotta say.
Thank you so much. I look forward to coming back to you in the Q&A and hearing some more about this. It's a really fascinating area. We will now move to our second speaker, speaking on the fantasy of whiteness in the slasher genre, by Michaela Wünsch, who wrote her dissertation in cultural studies on the serial killer as a medium of the unconscious of white masculinity. She received her PhD from Humboldt University, Berlin, Germany, and teaches film and media studies in the US and Europe, currently at the Alpen Adria University, Klagenfurt.
Yeah, hi there. I hope you can see my screen. Maybe not in the right way. Okay. So I'm glad to be part of this conference, and I had to cut out some pages from my paper, so I hope it still makes sense to you. Otherwise, we have to maybe discuss this. So my paper will focus on the male serial killer Michael Myers, who wears a mask in the slasher/stalkers film cycle, and I think Veronica will say more about this difference. And I will analyze the mask and the look of these figures through the framework of critical whiteness studies and Lacanian psychoanalysis, and ask what Michael Myers could tell us about white masculinity. Following the assumptions of whiteness studies, it is crucial for the position of whites to be unmarked and invisible. The male killer behind the white mask will be weaved in analogy of these elements of whiteness which is the cause of racial signification, but is itself not racially specified. So my dissertation, this book, focused mainly on the first prequel, which was then not a prequel, of the popular film cycle Halloween, that is best identified by a predominantly off-screen killer. In 1978, Michael Myers appeared on the US-American screen for the first time, and thanks to his indestructibleness, has not left it since. Until today, there have been 12 sequels, or the latest, Halloween Kills, will be released this October with a 1-year delay. In part 1, the spectator shares the perspective of Laurie, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who we have just seen, for almost the entire length of the film. But the striking scenes are those in which the camera's and audience perspective is the same as the killer's point of view. And we also heard something on the point of view. Michael is kept hidden from the audience for almost the entire film. Also, he is present. He's only fragmentarily visible. The spectator sees merely the back of his head, the shoulder, or leg, or his masked face. And the face mask was taken from a Captain Kirk mask, and then the hair was cut and it was painted white. And these are other shots where we only see parts of him. Film theorist Steve Neill interprets this cinematic composition as a refusal to stabilize Michael as an object of the look. In the context of critical whiteness studies, this kind of hiding has been considered as significant for the position of whites in social life and cinematic representation. One of the central assumptions of critical whiteness theorists like Ruth Frankenberg is that whites refuse to acknowledge that they are racialized subjects. Works by social theorists pronounce that whites ignore the social meaning of whiteness and describe themselves as non-ethnic. Instead, their belonging to the social group of whites is connected with the economic and social privileges. One aspect of the unexamined hegemony of whiteness is to ignore these privileges, or rather taking them for granted. Whites inhabit the status of an unmarked marker, as Frankenberg writes, and pretend to be universal, colorless, and unmarked by history, while non-whites understood to be particular and culturally determined. Philosopher George Yancey points out that even though the Ku Klux Klan is far from denying their aims, identity, and motivations, one of the functions of whiteness is not to spell out its name, so that in the final analysis, even the notion of innocent whites negates the racist implications of this white identity. Film scholar Richard Dyer follows the assumption and aims of these interpretations and applies them to the field of representation. He notes that while it is often mentioned that a particular film character is Black, Asian, or Latinx, it is seldom a point of interest if a character is white. At a level of representation, he remarks, whites are not of a certain race, they are just the human race. The purpose of naming whiteness, as Frankenberg and Dyer try to do, is not to recenter or even to re-essentialize whiteness. Instead, it is a strategy to name the meaning race has for whites and the revealing of the unnamed, the exposure of whiteness masquerading as universal. Rather than showing what's beyond the mask of universalism and emptiness, I also intend to demonstrate that whiteness is nothing but an empty signifier. So let's return to Halloween. Haddonfield, Illinois in 1963 seems to be a place where the idea of whiteness is an invisible norm. This place is a white ghetto and nobody notices it. And about suburbia, John has already said something, or white suburbia, and I think Miranda will also say something about it. Race doesn't matter in this whites-only place. One could analyze it in the words of the German film scholar Eva Ward, white seems to be no color and all colors at once, an empty place and also universal, all but nothing. Maybe this is the cause of its power. End of quote. Although Michael's position, marked as psychic deviant, does not seem to represent the norm,
Hi, Michaela, your sound has cut out and we can't hear you. There might be something wrong with your microphone.
can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, I put off the, okay.
Okay. Do you want to go back by like 30 seconds or so and pick up from there?
Yeah, where was I? And do you see my presentation in a continuing way? Because I see here.
It's not in the slideshow mode, if that's what you mean.
Ah, so what do you see? Still the first?
Yes, we just see the title slide.
Okay, that's weird.
But if you in the bottom left corner, if you click the slideshow icon, that should put it in full screen.
Now do you see? No. Okay, I can't do anything.
Michaela, if
it's
you
not so central, yeah.
Sorry, if you stop sharing your screen and just share it again, that might offer some kind of a fix.
Yeah, you still don't see my screen. That's weird. So you.
It's still on. It's still on. Oh, what happened? It was still on the first slide.
It's not so.
Just try one more time, and if it doesn't work, then we can just go without the PowerPoint presentation.
Allow.
Perfect.
You see another picture now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Great.
Okay. So my last question was, so first, did you hear about supposedly innocent child, the sentence? Okay, my next question was if we can read this mask of Michael Myers as a masquerading of a universality, or if it's possible or impossible to read the figure in terms of norm and its other. As Richard Dyer and others have suggested, whiteness, far from being universal, should be understood as a quite fixed set of meanings or properties. Such a reading would, however, reduce the white mask of universality to a representation of a form of false consciousness, beyond which the real content of white identity can be revealed. Departing from this approach, I want to try to analyze the figure and the mask of Michael more in terms of formal signification processes and in terms of looking relations rather than in terms of manifest issues. In the following, and if you don't hear me say something because I don't see the chat right now. Okay. In the following, I will use the framework of Kalpana Seshadri and Lacanian psychoanalysis and try to apply it on an interpretation of Halloween. In her analysis of whiteness, Seshadri points out that, quote, race is fundamentally a regime of looking and visibility. She asks how and why we read certain marks of the body as privileged sites of racial meaning. She asserts that the regime of visibility secures the investment that we make in race by thriving on arbitrary bodily details in order to shore up one's symbolic position. She summarizes a definition of whiteness as following, and it's a longer quote. By whiteness, I do not mean a physical or ideological property as it is invoked in whiteness studies, or a concept, a set of meanings that functions as a transcendental signified. By whiteness, I refer to a master signifier without a signified that establishes a structure of relations, a signifying chain that through a process of inclusions and exclusions constitutes a pattern for organizing human difference. We will therefore see how this symbolic structuration is related to visibility. Like a signifier without a signified, Michael seems to have no human properties at all. Neither has a transparent personal motive to kill, except the compulsion to repeat, nor does he, as the psychiatrist Dr. Loomis asserts, have a specific human character. Michael has no human emotions, no reason, no conscience. Veronica notes this lack of humanity is pronounced by the mask. Michael's face mask, like the mask created by the film frame itself, hides not only the killer's face, but also his humanity. In this way, the killer is abstracted, presented as the perfect embodiment of evil. He functions as the purveyor of an essential truth that these films argue, Dika writes. Michael is not just the purveyor of a principle, but also the very cause, an empty cause of incidents. So I don't agree with Dr. Loomis that Michael cannot differentiate. He does make differences in the sense Richard claims. He inhabits a position of a signifier that shapes human difference through inclusions and exclusions. He even emphasizes exclusions in the form of murder or slashing. He shapes the differences through the cuts of his knife or an axe. Dika has shown that the stalker film divides the characters of the young community between valued and devalued. The latter must die at the hands of the killer. In fact, Michael marks who is valued or devalued. This selection through cutting not only refers to the film production itself, it can be seen as a form of signification in general. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, the compulsion to repeat, that seems to be the only motive of the murders, is an important and general aspect of the signifying chain. As reflected in the title of Lacan's famous essay, Repetition is the very agency of the latter in the unconscious. At this point, it is important to bring to mind the often repeated sentence that the unconscious is structured like language, and that vice versa, the symbolic exists in the unconscious. Various authors, like for instance Robin Wood, claim that the killer in the slasher or stalker film is an embodiment of the it, which in Lacanian psychoanalysis means the unconscious and symbolic origin of being in language, the place from where the subject is being spoken, and from which Michael himself is being excluded because he's not speaking. Okay, great. Now comes ambulance. Seshadri claims that it is whiteness that should be discerned as an unconscious signifier, as a master signifier that enables a regime of visibility through signification but remains out of the system by his lack of language, for instance, and also by his not being the object of any gaze. I propose that Michael inhabits the position of a master signifier. The starting point of my analysis corresponds with the assumption of whiteness studies that whiteness functions as an unmarked marker. However, in following Seshadri, my approach also departs from this field. It differs from most approaches in whiteness studies that whiteness is understood as a signifier without fixed meaning. Whiteness is positioned both outside of the system that it enables, but at the same time places itself in the very center. This signifier, in its awesome and terrifying aspect, discloses itself as something inassimilable to to the very system that it causes and upholds, Seshadri writes. I would say this definition serves as a more useful explanation of Maya's position than the opposition of norm and deviance. Another aspect that speaks for the argument that Michael embodies a kind of whiteness as a master signifier can be found in the relation to sexual difference. According to Seshadri, race identity can only have one function. It establishes different relations among the races to constitute the logic of domination. Whiteness does not only signify but promises something: wholeness and totality, the overcoming of lack and difference, especially the constitutive lack of the sex subject. Lacan and John Kopchak locate sexual difference in the realm of the real. That also means that sexual difference is not representable, but brings reason and language to its own limit. Seshadri proposes that whiteness attempts to install itself in the place of linguistic contradiction, of being, where the subject fades from meaning. Such an attempt to totalize and inflate the subject can only produce anxiety. And this is why this master signifier might be also situated in the horror film genre. The first sequence of Halloween, the voyeuristic look at the kissing couple, has been described as a kind of reenactment of the primal scene or voyeuristic trauma the moment a child recognizes sexual difference. Michael's reaction to his discovery of sexual difference is to kill his sister, to flee the limitation that is bound to sexual difference, and to install himself in an omnipotent position. And this attempt produces anxiety. This position does not merely include to reinstall difference by killing, but corresponds with an omnipotent and frightening position of looking. According to Lacan, there's only one condition to see the gaze. He writes, painters, above all, have grasped this gaze as such in the mask. It is the mask that demonstrates the functions of the gaze, that Kopchak remarks that some meaning is left unrevealed. The mask suggests that there is something beyond, something to be regained. And according to Seshadri, whiteness promises to overcome the lack to regain the self by encountering the gaze. And I quote her again, the fantasy of encountering whiteness would be for the subject of race to recover the missing substance of one's being. It would be to coincide not with a transcendental ideal, some rarefied model of bodily perfection, but with the gaze. That void in the other, a piece of the real that could annihilate difference. She assumes that whiteness as an object A is the thing beyond appearance that promises to regain this wholeness. But beyond the mask, there is not a thing, but the evil or blind look, the absence of a signified in Halloween. Whiteness now tries to fill the space which must remain empty. According to Lacan, anxiety begins where there is something where nothing should be, the lack of a lack. Whiteness tries to overcome the lack. It promises a fantasy where difference and lack are wholly extinguished. One sign of this is the immortality of Michael Myers. But to encounter the gaze, to encounter something where it has to be nothing, means not to regain wholeness, but to die. This is because the point of the gaze marks the subject's very annihilation. In other words, it is what the subject does not see and not simply what it sees that founds it. To see the organizer of the look, the cause of visibility, is an impossibility that is fulfilled in Halloween with lethal results for the lookers. So my conclusion, white masculinity as it figured out by the masked serial killer in the Stalker film seems to have no specific racialized properties. Maybe a bit contradictory what Kelly just said. Instead, the killer installs a system of visual differentiation. Myers tries to inhabit an impossible position, that of totality, ubiquity, immortality, and wholeness.
short, that of being without meaning. He embodies the gaze as object A as well as the gaze of the other, or both coincide in his point of view. On the one side, he is beyond the symbolic order, or beyond the wall of language. He doesn't even speak. He cannot be integrated in the suburban community of Haddonfield. He escapes intersubjectivity, language, and lethality by installing himself as the organizer of the whole scene. His gaze as object A is nothing but the way the objective neutral view of the entire picture is in the picture itself, to refer to Zizek. The big other, this objective neutral view that whiteness as organizer of visibility inhabits, coincide with Michael Myers' evil look behind the mask. The film does not show racial visibility as such, but the structuration that it enables and the implication of whiteness as its master signifier. So, okay, so I hope I was heard. Yeah,
Yes.
okay, okay.
Yes, definitely. In fact, it was the quality of the sound was better after the problem. So
I'll also close the window for the Q&A.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your fascinating paper. And it has generated lots of really active discussion in the comments, which we can hopefully come back to in the Q&A. And for now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker. Dr. Miranda Corcoran is lecturer in 21st century literature at University College Cork, Ireland. She is currently writing a monograph on adolescence and witchcraft in American popular culture. That sounds really cool. And she is also the co-editor with Steve Gronert-Ellerhoff on exploring the horror of supernatural fiction, Ray Bradbury's Elliot Family. And she'll be speaking on There's a Maniac Loose in the City, Space, Identity, and Boundary Crossing in the Urban Slasher. Take it away, Miranda.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen awkwardly as I narrate what I'm doing. There we go. The worst thing about going last is that I have to follow two absolutely amazing papers. So I'm not relishing that. But anyway, I'll get started. So this paper focuses on 3 controversial slasher films set in New York City during the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And it argues that each of these films associates violence with the permeable boundaries of the cityscape. Now, I'll probably diverge a little bit from the 2 previous speakers in that while I will be discussing the phenomenon of white flight quite extensively, I'll probably be leaning more into questions of class. Now, when I describe these films as controversial, I'm mostly referring to the manner in which each of them ran afoul of censorship laws and moral crusades during the so-called video nasties moral panic that took hold in Great Britain during the 1980s. So the first film I'm speaking about, Driller Killer, directed by Abel Ferreira, was banned under the Video Recordings Act 1984. The second film I'm talking about, Maniac, directed by William Lustig, was never officially a video nasty. However, it was refused classification in Britain during its initial release, and it was seized by police in a number of locales around the UK. This seems to be more based on its reputation and its pretty gruesome cover art more than its actual content. And then lastly, the final film I'm going to be talking about as part of this presentation is The New York Ripper, which was directed by the Italian giallo pioneer Lucio Fulci, and as a result, I think exemplifies the often unstable generic distinction between gialli and slashers, which was, of course, discussed earlier. And this film is perhaps the most notorious of the 3 films I'm going to be discussing. When it was first submitted to the British Board of Film Classification, one member of staff described it as simply the most damaging film I have ever seen in my life, and it was banned in the UK until 2002. Now, while these films are interesting in terms of both their popular reception and their nihilistic treatment of violence, as well as the manner in which this led to them falling victim to various censorship crusades. In my presentation, what I really want to focus on is their representation of urban space. All three of these films were produced just as the phenomenon of white flight resulted in a large-scale exodus of middle-class white Americans from the city of New York, and crucially, just before urban renewal projects led to the redevelopment of notoriously squalid or vice-ridden areas like 42nd Street and Times Square. And in analyzing these films, I'm going to draw on Samuel Orr Delaney's 1999 study, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and his argument that prior to their renovation, New York's seedier neighborhoods served as important cultural loci that promoted contact and communication across the lines of race, class, gender, and sexuality. However, I'm also going to argue that where Delaney views such boundary crossings as pleasurable and productive, many contemporary commentators feared their capacity to destabilize ingrained social hierarchies. And the three films discussed in this paper display, as a result, a profound ambivalence about the fluidity of boundaries within an urban context, appearing simultaneously intrigued by the dynamism of city spaces, the exciting aspects, or the exciting possibilities opened up by boundary crossing, but at the same time, they seem repulsed by their potential for violence and disorder. So, during the first wave of American slasher films produced during the late 1970s and early 1980s, terror lurked in typically middle-class, overwhelmingly white spaces. Kara M. Kavaran notes that throughout the formative years of the American teen slasher, we can find a repeated trope wherein young people must learn that, quote, summer camps, small towns, and suburbs, the very hallmarks of safe middle-class America, the world their baby boomer parents created for them was, in fact, not safe at all. These films, Kavaran explains, generally provide viewers with a comfortable, familiar setting, a place that she says should be safe, but has been perverted by the killer. The suburbs in particular possess an important symbolic value in American culture and within the slasher as well. As an icon of post-World War II American affluence, the suburban environment is one that carefully separates out and polices racial, class, sexual, and gender identities. When a killer stalks the suburbs, these boundaries are momentarily threatened, but ultimately reaffirmed as the murderer is dispatched and order is restored. As Sorka Nivialon points out, quote, the ideal white suburban neighborhood consistently survives these narratives despite any invading slasher, end quote. So suburban neighborhoods are ubiquitous in the slashers of this period. In films like Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street, they are presented as idyllic, albeit homogeneous spaces. Overwhelmingly white and middle class, the placid streets of Haddonfield, Illinois, and Springwood, Ohio, are inhabited by a population described by the sociologist Lewis Mumford, who was writing in the 1960s, as, quote, people of the same class, the same income, the same age group, witnessing the same television performances, eating the same tasteless prefabricated foods from the same freezers, conforming in every outward and inward respect to the common mold. When violence comes to these placid neighborhoods, it is usually brought about by the intrusion of some figuration of difference. Nivialon argues that while most, if not all, of these slasher villains are white, they are usually avatars of some form of socioeconomic otherness, transient figures with poorly paid jobs or no permanent home. They temporarily bring violence and chaos to the neatly ordered suburban utopia, but their disruptive presence is almost invariably expelled before the final credits roll. Now, this homogeneity does, of course, make sense if we consider the social context of the post-Halloween slasher boom. Erica Villa points out that during the period between the 1940s and the 1970s, quote, suburbanization, a mode of urbanization in which cities extend outward rather than upward to accommodate the spatial appetites of homeowners, retailers, and industrialists, reached a pinnacle, end quote. And at this time, America's suburban population increased from 35.1 million to 75.6 million between 1950 and 1970. First appearing in the late 1940s to provide accessible, affordable homes for returning World War II servicemen and their families, suburban housing developments offered the utopian prospect of a clean, quasi-bucolic environment within commuting distance of major cities. Moreover, post-war initiatives such as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill, ensured that former soldiers could secure cheap mortgages and low-interest loans on their new homes. However, while such initiatives made home ownership possible for an entire generation of white Americans, practices such as redlining, restrictive covenants, and municipal incorporation, along with violence and intimidation, ensured that the utopian promise of suburbia did not extend to people of color. Instead, as Avila points out, federally sponsored suburbanization removed an expanding category of white Americans from what deteriorated into inner city reservations of racialized poverty. The ability of white, upwardly mobile Americans to flee urban centers for the fresh air and safety of the suburbs has been termed white flight, which Avila describes or defines as, quote, a structural process by which post-war suburbanization helped the racial resegregation of the United States, dividing presumably white suburbs from concentrations of racialized poverty. Moreover, by the early 1980s, just as the slasher was becoming a highly visible genre, the election of President Ronald Reagan further solidified the divide between impoverished urban centers and affluent suburbs as social infrastructure like Medicare and Social Security were decimated. So the resegregation of the US and the re-entrenchment of both class and racial divides thus ensured that suburbia was delimited by rigid boundaries whose breach could only signify a calamitous threat to the social order. Any force that threatened or briefly permeated these boundaries was figured as an anomaly whose expurgation would reaffirm the divisions they had momentarily underlined. The proliferation of suburban slashers makes a great deal of sense within this context. The suburbs are a homogeneous, rigidly stratified space, and it is therefore very easy to frame an intrusive force as disruptive. Conversely, slashers set in urban spaces are comparatively rare. While there are many reasons for this, including the primarily adolescent or young adult demographic of 80s slasher audiences, I would argue that the heterogeneity of city spaces ensures that social boundaries are less clearly delineated, and the transgression of such boundaries is a far more mundane occurrence. Geographers England and Simon note that because cities are diverse, often containing radically different communities living in close proximity, boundaries can be challenged and unease can occur. So the three films that I'm going to focus on for the remainder of this paper, Driller Killer, Maniac, and The New York Ripper, all portray New York as a heterogeneous space in which different race, class, and gender identities interact in scenarios that are framed as alternately productive and threatening. Driller Killer focuses on a young artist named Reno Miller, played by the film's director, Abel Ferreira. Reno lives in a squalid apartment near Union Square, while his accent and appearance code him as working class. Reno, who will soon embark on a killing spree using the eponymous power tool, navigates a social milieu comprised of drug addicts, homeless derelicts, and middle or upper class members of the artistic community. The borders separating these classes appear fluid. A wealthy gallery owner casually calls to Reno's rundown apartment, and 2 young women described by another character as nice girls and coded as upper class by their well-tailored clothes and expensive shoes sing with the grubby punk band that rehearses in the apartment above Reno's. The narrative is also intercut with documentary-style footage shot by Ferreira of the city's homeless population. In one particularly uncomfortable scene, the camera lingers on an intoxicated man falling asleep on the sidewalk as vomit seeps from his half-open mouth. In the standard suburban slasher of this period, such scenes of abjection normally only occur after the disruptive presence of the killer has brought violence and disorder to a once placid community. In Ferreira's New York, however, such abject imagery is interwoven into the social fabric of the city. Now, before I move on, I should state that Ferreira's inclusion of footage of New York's homeless population is not necessarily intended to be exploitative, though it could be read as such. Rather, he seems to be interested in highlighting the degradation experienced by the homeless and their vulnerability to violence. And this is rendered explicit in an early scene in the film where Reno sees a newspaper headline that reads, quote, "State abandons mentally ill," end quote. And this seems to be an allusion to the rapid process of deinstitutionalization that during the 1960s and 70s saw many individuals released from psychiatric hospitals and returned to the community with little or no support. Like Driller Killer, William Lustig's Maniac portrays New York as a dynamic social arena in which members of the working class, like the perennially filthy serial killer Frank Zito, seen here, are free to interact unproblematically with middle and upper class characters, like the elegant photographer Anna, played by Carolyn Monroe, who you can see here in the background. Similarly, Fulci's New York Ripper imagines the titular city as a fluid site where members of the primarily white professional and middle classes regularly encounter both the working classes and other racial groups. Now, according to the science fiction author and literary critic Samuel Orr Delany, prior to the radical redevelopment of 42nd Street and Times Square that commenced in 1995 under the mayorship of Rudy Giuliani, the porn theaters, peep shows, and sex industries that had defined these locales promoted cross-community contact between individuals of different races and classes. Delany argues that the rejuvenation of these areas, a process sometimes popularly referred to as the Disneyfication of Times Square, he argues that this rejuvenization process served to create the illusion of safety for certain, mostly white middle-class groups who fear the kind of intercommunity contact he describes. In his book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, Delany claims that prior to its redevelopment, Times Square was dominated by the poor and working class, who regularly interacted with middle and upper class individuals who often traveled there for the specific purposes of engaging in often sexual interclass contact. For Delany, this is a dynamic process. Drawing on his own experiences of visiting gay porn theaters in the 1970s and 80s, Delany maintains, quote, "Life is at its most rewarding, productive, and pleasant when large numbers of people understand, appreciate, and seek out interclass contact and communication in a mode of goodwill," unquote. However, he also notes that, quote, "the class war raging constantly and often silently perpetually works for the erosion of the social practices through which interclass communication takes place." Thus, for Delany, intergroup contact is dynamic, productive, and desirable. However, while Delany frames this kind of contact as enriching and pleasurable, many contemporary observers viewed the breakdown of social barriers with trepidation. The New York described by Delany was in many ways made possible by a fiscal crisis that reached its peak during the 1970s. Alongside a nationwide recession that began in 1973, New York suffered immensely as a result of white flight. As white middle-class New Yorkers abandoned the city for suburban developments, the number of tax-paying businesses and households decreased, leaving the city unable to pay for operating expenses, including waste disposal, hospitals, and adequate policing and fire services. During these years, as crime rates peaked, visitors to New York airports were provided with a pamphlet entitled Fear City, a survival guide for visitors to New York City. The pamphlet, which was created and distributed by the Council for Public Safety, cautioned against, and by implication attributed the city's violence to, the forms of intercommunity contact endorsed by Delaney. The pamphlet warns readers to confine their movements to the more affluent, overwhelmingly white area of Midtown and to avoid the Bronx in particular. The three films I'm discussing here are deeply ambivalent in their treatment of interclass contact, vacillating between Delaney's celebratory vision and a more paranoid view of ubiquitous violence brought about through the same mode of interclass contact. Driller Killer initially presents cross-class interaction as dynamic and generative, artistically productive. The film grounds itself in the punk subculture of 1970s New York, opening with a title card that reads, "This film should be played loud." Later, one of the characters visits the famous music venue, Max's Kansas City. Reno, who, as I mentioned earlier, is very much coded as working class, is portrayed as having the opportunity for upward mobility via his connections with the New York art scene. He also spends time sketching and talking with the homeless population of Union Square. At the same time, Driller Killer presents New York's fluid social boundaries as dangerous. In contrast to the suburban slasher, violence does not arrive with the sudden appearance of a knife-wielding maniac. It is presented as an ongoing feature of urban life. An early scene which predates Reno's killing spree shows his roommate reading newspaper items about shocking violent crimes. So Reno's violence is thus portrayed as merely one facet of a chaotic urban space. When Reno eventually snaps as a result of his neighbor's loud music, which living in an apartment building I kind of get, when he eventually snaps, his violence is indiscriminate. He preys on the homeless men he had previously befriended and on an upper-class art dealer who insulted his latest painting. In these sequences, interclass contact becomes a source of violence and danger. Similarly, in Maniac, Frank's interclass friendship with the elegant photographer Anna is presented, at least initially, as a genuinely meaningful relationship and a possible source of redemption for an otherwise despicable killer. Again, the permeable social boundaries that facilitate both Frank and Anna's movement across class lines ultimately become a source of danger, as Frank uses his proximity to Anna to stalk the models she works with. A long, tense sequence in which a young nurse, dressed in an immaculately clean white uniform, is hunted by Frank through a filthy, graffiti-covered subway, likewise suggests that points of intersection between the middle and lower classes can be conceived as threatening spaces. As England and Simon note, quote, looking at aspects such as gendered, aged, and sexualized geographies of fear, urban researchers have noted that fear of the city is often related to discourses surrounding those who are seen as different in social contexts, end quote. In this scenario, the nurse's difference, her cleanliness and professional status, is starkly juxtaposed against the dirt and dereliction of the subway and its nighttime denizens. An analogous sequence takes place in the New York Ripper, when a well-groomed, fashionably dressed young woman is attacked on the subway. As in Maniac, the girl's cleanliness, accentuated by her pale skin and blonde hair, presents a mode of overt physical difference when framed against the filthy train carriage. Again, as in the other films discussed in this paper, there is an ambivalence associated with interclass contact. While a number of scenes in this film imbue locales like the notorious 42nd Street with an intense, almost palpable paranoia achieved through menacing POV driving shots, other sequences, in contrast, present these spaces as dynamic and exciting. For example, in one early scene, a well-dressed woman attends a live sex show. She is visibly distinguished from the rest of the audience, both by her gender, everyone else is male, and her neat, carefully tailored appearance. Yet despite her visible difference, she takes pleasure in the performance and enjoys her immersion in this ordinarily lower class milieu. These examples ultimately bring us back to where we started. It is impossible to definitively identify either a progressive or a reactionary attitude to interclass contact in these films. They are fundamentally ambivalent, representing urban space as both the site of meaningful, productive cross-group interactions and dangerously transgressive acts of boundary crossing. They are also more complex and ultimately more nihilistic than suburban slashers of the same period. Where the suburban slasher might portray violence and disorder as the result of a temporary act of boundary crossing, in their urban analogues, the killer's brutality is framed as simply part of a much broader, ongoing pattern of violence. In these films, the boundaries that separate distinct social groups cannot be reaffirmed because they were presented as permeable from the outset. Ultimately, this may explain why films like Driller Killer, Maniac, and The New York Ripper proved so controversial. While The New York Ripper is an unflinchingly sadistic film, neither Driller Killer nor Maniac is significantly more violent than a standard teen slasher like Friday the 13th. However, unlike the suburban teen slashers of the period, they do not provide a closing reassurance that the social boundaries protecting middle-class security and separation will be reestablished. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. So we will now hold a Q&A. There has been lots and lots of really lively and fascinating discussion going on in the comments. So I'll do my best to try to separate what seem to be just sort of comments on the fly from kind of questions, but sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell the difference. And there was even like a tangent into the Batman series, and the extent to which that is, the representation of Gotham is inspired by the era from the era you're talking about, Miranda. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that as a kind of, that's interesting. So I'm going to pick out one of the first questions that cropped up, which is directed at Kaylee. Apologies, I didn't note down who asked this question, but the question is, considering that gender and gender expression is a social construct, what should a feminist final girl look like in terms of encapsulating a non-male personality type / trait?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the concern isn't so much non-male, it's like non-colonial, right? So, like, the example that I always go back to is like Ripley from Alien. Like, we all celebrate Ripley because she's this woman, she doesn't take any shit. Like, as a youth, I like sort of was like, whoa, this is so cool and revolutionary. But as I became older and sort of started thinking more about my indigeneity, right, I realized that there's a really troubling choice that occurs in that movie, because I also identify with the xenomorph, because the xenomorph is an indigenous woman protecting her land from colonialism, right? And so for me, it's the final girl is this really interesting sort of figure, because it emerges for Clover as this like, potentially liberatory subject where it's like women get all of this agency. But the reality of it is that white women get a certain sort of agency in exchange for perpetuating the dispossession of indigenous peoples. And I think this sort of, I was sort of thinking about this too during Miranda's discussion about, say, I love Sam Delaney. Sam Delaney's great. But when Sam Delaney writes about, the sort of Black queer sort of freedom within the space of the pornography theater in New York City, what that freedom requires is the dispossession of the Lenape people, because you have to take the land from the Lenape people in order to build that theater. And so, it's a sort of roundabout way of saying, and I think what I'm trying to get at in my presentation is that the sort of the politics of representation, of sort of plugging, say, like there in the questions there were discussion of like Fear Street, which I've seen part of the first one. The problem with just sort of plugging, say, like a brown or a Black woman's body into that system is that it's still ultimately on this trajectory of assimilating that body into like a sort of colonial epistemology. And so it's the process of like, we can extend humanity to Black and brown women, Black and brown queer women, so long as they participate in all of this other gross colonial stuff, right? And so in terms of what would a sort of a final girl narrative that didn't do all that stuff, what would that look like? I mean, in terms of the relationship to the monster, it would be entirely different. In indigenous epistemologies, there's not other beings that aren't human aren't scary because they aren't human. Like human beings we're like the youngest things, and we're like silly and dumb, and we're not that important. And so something's not frightening because it's not human. And so that would have to be a sort of fundamental sort of epistemological assumption that informed the rest of the narrative. I think something that gets close to it, or that gets close to like questioning some of these. Stephen Graham Jones has a new book called My Heart is a Chainsaw that's coming out. It has a native final girl, and most of the text is sort of trying to make sense of all the ways that Indigenous women have been sort of imagined outside of the frameworks of the final girl. So I think that sort of gets at similar questions that I'm getting at. But yeah, I think it's again, this problem, it's the overrepresentation of man, that man can be extended to bodies which are non-white, non-male, so long as all of the other epistemological assumptions that are associated with that are upheld.
I'm just still kind of reeling a little bit from your observation about alien and the xenomorph being read as indigenous, which makes complete sense. And now I'll think of that in a whole new light. And as you were suggesting, just kind of there in your answer, there's also lots of really productive links between your paper and the other papers here. And in particular, there was a comment drawing links between your paper and the idea of the theorization of whiteness and what Miranda was talking about in relation to the white flights and creation to the suburb. So I'll use that to segue into a question for Miranda from the chat. The question is, with the blending of lower and upper class people taking part in transgressive acts, do urban slashers suggest that in mass, anonymity presents opportunity for cross-caste cohesion in areas?
That's a really interesting question. And actually, yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about, some of these points about the theorization of whiteness while I was going through my paper. And one thing that really struck me was Avila's point when he's defining white flight, about how white flight helped to facilitate the movement of an expanding category of white Americans to the suburb, because in that movement to the suburbs, you are expanding the category of what it means to be white, which is in itself a sort of, unstable category. So you're bringing new groups who are defined by white via their capacity, or defined as white by their capacity to move to these suburban areas into the broader category of white. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And I do think that, yeah, in these texts, particularly in something like Driller Killer, there is this sense that in the sort of the somewhat anonymous mass of the city, that there is this opportunity for cross-group cohesion and interaction that produces something productive, because the film focuses quite heavily on New York's artistic scene from in the 1970s, so on the punk movement and on the visual arts as well. And sort of like everything else in the film, it's a little bit ambivalent, whereby on the one hand, it definitely represents a sort of generative environment in which this dynamic melding of different groups creates an exciting, artistically productive environment. But on the other hand, it also kind of shows how certain individuals are exploited as part of that, how I think success or progression within the artistic movement is easier for people, albeit, higher class, for example, and, people from lower class backgrounds who might be trying to work within that field are sort of more likely to be blocked or more likely to be exploited. So again, it's sort of ambivalent, and it's sort of constantly shifting like a lot of what's happening in these films. But yeah, I think there's definitely that suggestion.
Great. I'm going to throw a question at Michaela now. There was lots of really lively discussion going on in the chat while you were speaking about when Michael does wear a mask and when he doesn't wear a mask, and kind of what that means at different times. So one of the specific questions that came up was, could it be argued that the shape has more humanity without the mask, therefore reforming to the man, Michael Myers?
Could you also put it in the written thing?
Of course.
I mean,
I'll try to. I'll put it in.
Always like wears the mask. I mean, I concentrate on the first part.
I just put it into the private chat for you.
Okay. I mean, but then I also found some shots where even the mask has some humanity or implies some humanity. For instance, in the recent sequels, the mask ages. It's not the mask of the, I mean, of course, a mask wouldn't age, but Michael Myers' mask ages. It gets older with the sequels. So I would say so I think my general thesis is still okay, that with the mask, there is this lack of humanity and also this lack of mortality and the lack of speech and so on. But if one could really watches this in details or in shots, there are some, it's not only the mask, but some gestures that makes him like a tiny bit human. Yeah. So I think, yeah, the later sequels maybe gives him the humanity in this aging process. You can see in the mask, yeah.
There was also a comment in the chat about the implications of the work overalls that Michael wears in the Halloween films. Like, does this imply like that he's a member of the proletariat? And I think that possibly has some links with what Kaylee was saying about how the kind of quote unquote villains in the Captivity narratives have a tendency to be indigenous and racialized others.
Yeah, I thought about this too. It has a blue collar implication. Is on the one side. On the other side, if you read it in terms of male uniformity or uniforms in general, like military, police, and so on and so forth, it also has like something of this male masquerading itself as like nothing, not like in contrary to the female masquerade, which is like make yourself pretty. Male masquerading is like make yourself more or less invisible. I think his blue collar suit has more to do with his invisibility than with his class, because as we've seen in the first movie, he is from this middle-class suburban home. He doesn't have a working class background. He has a middle-class background. But of course, he was in the hospitalized for a long time and so on. So this makes him not really a member anymore of the middle class. But my thesis is somehow that he is like the internal of this white suburban class, like the evil part, the master signifying part, maybe also like the working class part that has been excluded to be part of this suburban community. So even maybe people have working class income, they still pretend to be middle class.
Excellent. There are a few questions for Miranda here, so I'm going to pick one at random. Somebody asks if you have any thoughts on how the class divide has shifted somewhat from geographical divisions to other factors like economic stability. And they mention films like Spree, as well as in general, the idea of the gig economy work as relating to this.
So I haven't seen Spree, but I'll add it to my ever-expanding list of things to watch. But I think that's a really, really interesting point, because I think that makes those very boundaries that I've been talking about almost more unstable in a broader sense, because it's very hard to delineate class now based on things like geographical location, because, as you said, so many people are working in precarious or gig economy situations where it's potentially, firstly, I suppose, more pervasive, but also kind of difficult to identify or articulate someone's class based on where they live or what they're presently doing. And I feel like this is something that a lot of academics can probably empathize with, because a lot of, especially younger academics, are in a situation where they might be working on, fixed term or part-time contracts, and therefore they may be presenting the appearance of being, middle class, when in reality they might be earning hourly wages, or they might be in a situation where their employment isn't secure. So therefore, how do we define them then if they're presenting the appearance of middle class, but actually in a very insecure and financially unstable position? So I think it actually, as much as these films present the crossing of class boundaries in New York in the 70s and 80s as unsettling in some ways, I think our current situation is even more unsettling, because there isn't that, it's not as overt, it's just much more omnipresent, and that insecurity is much more pervasive and insidious. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to check out Spree, because I the more I think about it, the more I'm feeling that our current sort of reliance on the gig economy is sort of a horror in itself, and would probably make a very good horror movie.
Really interesting stuff. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to pick out a question that hopefully might relate to everyone's papers. Now, this one was asked specifically in relation to Kaylee's paper, but it's kind of about theorizing whiteness more generally. And they asked what it would look like to theorize whiteness, and in particular, how that might help us to think about something like the Karen moment that we have. Kaylee, do you want to maybe start us off on that?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully my paper is sort of a performance of theorizing whiteness from a sort of Indigenous studies perspective. Because I think, as Michaela's presentation pointed out, whiteness wants to imagine, like in Richard Wildworth's, whiteness wants to imagine itself as nothing. And so that's why I sort of turned to Sylvia Winters to think about the ways that whiteness aligns itself with the human, and sort of universalizes one particular perspective, which is a sort of white masculine perspective, and says this is the one way of looking at the world, this is the one way of functioning in the world. And I think for me, part of sort of the bringing attention to the sort of invisibility of whiteness within final girl studies is to sort of go back to like the sort of reliance on psychoanalytic theory, because that sort of was Freud's mistake. Is Freud like interviewed a bunch of white people and was like, this is how everyone's brain must work, is how all these white people's brains work. And that's absolutely not true. And that's that exact sort of move to overrepresent man as the sort of one partial perspective. And so, yeah, I think, things that help me theorize this are thinking about, Black and Indigenous perspectives on looking and thinking about how those epistemologies produce very different relationships to the screen. So if people want things that have helped me think about this, are definitely Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, Bell Hooks's work on Black looks, I think I always go back to Jody Bird's work, because in Miranda, in your presentation, a term that came up was, the reservationism, sort of alluding to gentrification or alluding to ghettoization as reservationism. And Jody Bird, sort of in her book, thinks about the ways that the dispossession of indigenous peoples produces a sort of prototype for subsequent dispossession of other people. And so when that came up, I was like, yes, this is exactly what's happening. So those are things that helped me sort of theorize this, and to think about, in what moments is sort of whiteness presenting itself as this universal, when it's actually sort of partial, situated history that's coming from a particular perspective.
Great. Well, we've basically run out of time now, but they were really good questions, really good papers. So thank you very much to everyone involved. And I can see Wickham's popped up, so I guess I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaylee, Michaela, and Miranda. Those wonderful papers. And Kat did a brilliant job chairing. Thank you all. It's been fantastic. Right. So we're ready to move on to panel, the next panel on genre and the transnational influence of Italian giallo. And this is going to be chaired by Valeria Viegas Lindvall. So yes, welcome, Valeria, and thank you so much for chairing.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. So, and thank you for that brilliant panel. That was such a wonderful way to just lead into this next one. So welcome to the panel, Generic Absence and the Cultural Politics of Reappropriation. Today we have two different speakers. So we're going to start with Dr. Orquidea Morales. So I'm going to present you really quick. Dr. Orquidea Morales is an assistant professor of American Studies and Media and Communication Studies at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. Morales received her PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan in 2018. Her work on border violence, Latinx media, and Chicana feminism has been published in journals such as Film Quarterly, Label Me Latina o Latino, and the Utah Foreign Language Review, as well as the anthology, The Routledge Companion to Latino Media. She is currently working on her book manuscript, tentatively titled Border Horror, Genre, and Death on the U.S.-Mexico Border, which I'm personally very much looking forward to reading. So I'll take it away, Orquidea.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valeria, for that introduction. So I'm going to share screen. Let's see. Okay. So just give me a second. It's making me give access to this, to Google Chrome for some reason. Okay. So for some reason, it's not letting me share. Can I?
Okay. Yeah, I suppose you could send it over to me, and I could run the presentation for you if you want.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, let me just drop my email in the private chat, and
Okay.
It'll just hold us up a moment.
Yeah.
Okay. Send it to me, and as soon as I bring it up, you can just cue me whenever you want me to change the slide.
Thank you.
All right.
So let me do this real quick. So while that goes through, I'll just go ahead and get started.
That's fine. Yeah,
okay.
I'll bring it up in the meantime as soon as it comes up.
Thank you. So today I'm talking about my presentation's titled La Llorona and the Absence of Latinx Slashers. So in this presentation, I discuss the absence of Latinx slashers and really broadly thinking about the absence of Latinx communities within the horror genre. This is an important question for multiple reasons, one of them being that Latinos or Latinx communities are one of the biggest audiences of horror films in the US and really internationally. But they rarely are represented on screen beyond a few roles, and mostly kind of as the villain or mostly as this like external locale. So it's mostly within the Latin American context when they are represented. So I read the invisibility of Latinx in slashers as a clear indication of the US desire to create and expand gentrified spaces. So kind of thinking about this conversation that Miranda started about white flight, right? And what that looks beyond the US border. Second, I introduced La Llorona, a monster usually seen as a ghost, as a possible Latinx slasher by analyzing the direct-to-video film The Wailer or La Llorona, which was released in 2006. In this film, the Latina body is sexualized and turned monstrous as La Llorona becomes a slasher, stabbing and massacring teens who invade her space. By centering the absence of race and then recentering our definition of slasher around a brown woman, La Llorona, I aim to begin a conversation about Latinos in horror. So who is La Llorona? I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the story. La Llorona translates to the wailer or the weeping woman. The image and myth of La Llorona has been continuously used in films, beginning in Mexico. The first horror film in Mexico was actually a Llorona film in 1933. Then into the US, and there's other countries that have created Llorona films, including the most recent 2019 award-winning movie from Guatemala named La Llorona. I found a movie from India from the 1960s that was also about La Llorona, which is a weird outlier. This monster has terrified audiences for really centuries, yet little has been written about her in relation to film and through a horror studies perspective. So the story of La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, is one of a woman who's usually described as indigenous or mestiza in Mexico, who falls in love with and has children, 1 to 2 children, with a man that is either Spanish or or upper class, right? So outside of her status, outside of her racial boundaries. So they have children out of wedlock, and then he decides to leave her for someone of his own socioeconomic racial status. And after this happens, she decides to drown her children as a form of revenge. So the idea with this narrative is really about understanding or creating boundaries around the role of women, definitely about, no sex before marriage and things like that. The legend, after she kills her children, the legend goes that she haunts that body of water and she looks for children to replace her own. So she usually takes children and drowns them. That's the usual telling of the legend. Different variations include La Llorona that drowns children as a form of revenge, right? As this lover that left her, so she's a jilted lover that kills the one thing that her partner wanted or loves. There are other versions where she drowns her children accidentally, but is so overtaken by remorse and sorrow that she kills herself. In one version, the weeping woman is poor, like I said, with a man who is typically the father of her children. She drowns her children. A second frequent variation presents a woman dating a man who is not the father of her children. And after he threatens to leave her because he is not ready to be a father, La Llorona drowns her children in hopes that he will stay with her. In other words, La Llorona kills her children to save the relationship. All these versions play a role in teaching women and men proper gender roles. Variations of La Llorona and her prevalence along the US-Mexico border, though, also remind us of the precarity of familial structures and the loss of children to ICE, cartels, and the environment. So beginning in the mid-60s, definitely into today, a lot of Chicana feminists have recuperated the image of La Llorona as an image of a woman that is crying out against injustices, that has a voice when women of color traditionally don't. So there's this sense of power behind the image of La Llorona, and she has been used in art and literature to represent that. Most recently, in protests in Mexico City, for example, she has been used, and the song La Llorona has been used as a way for women of missing family members or mothers of missing who have missing children to kind of point out the injustices of the political system. So her usage has changed quite a bit across time and space. So for some reason, it's still not going through. I'm just gonna keep going without visual aids for now, which I haven't done in a while, but we'll make it work. So the movie I'm talking about today is the 2006 direct-to-video movie, The Wailer, La Llorona, directed by Andres Navia. It has a very standard horror movie plot where 6 friends and college students, so they're Andrew, Mike, Jay, Michelle, Ashley, and Julie. They go to Mexico on vacation, and then on their first night there, they're sitting around eating tacos, as you do in Mexico, and they're talking about not having a place to stay. There's no hotels available in this small town. And this guy comes up to them and offers them a cabin. They, of course, say yes. So they go to the middle of nowhere to this cabin and start partying. And that's where they see La Llorona. In this film, La Llorona is framed within the slasher genre, which is a traditional American horror subgenre, by using the cultural icon of La Llorona that many Latinx audiences would be familiar with. Within a typical American slasher film context, the film aims to maintain their core Latinx audience, while at the same time appealing to non-Latinx audiences by making a slasher film in English. So the way this movie was distributed is really interesting. It's actually a trilogy, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But it was available usually under the label of like Spanish films, like Spanish language films, or Latino film, even though the movie is in English, right? So it kind of tried to vacillate between these different audiences. Okay. So although the distributor Laguna Productions classifies the movie as a supernatural movie, which it kind of is. I also want us to think about it again as a slasher because of the archetypes and the way that the plot is built. And one of the things that I want to think about as I keep working on this is its relationship of this movie to mockbusters and direct-to-video markets that play with traditional plots and tropes, right? And rarely change them. They just change the cast to make it look multi-ethnic, right? To, again, cater to different audiences that the mainstream films don't cater to in the same way. Oh, yes. Thank you so much. So I'm on slide 4. I guess, yeah. So this is the cover of the movie The Wailer. And on the right, you see the image of La Llorona. So in this movie, she is with a man who doesn't want her children. He's not the father. She drowns them. And then after he realizes what she's done, he stabs her and kills her. And she becomes La Llorona. So we kind of see the different faces of her. So it's important to emphasize the slasher aspect that La Llorona shares with slashers who are traditionally male, white in the US. Slashers, as the name implies, use sharp objects, including nails, blades, machetes, and knives, and chainsaws to stab and slash their victims. Carol Clover explains why stabbing and slashing are important aspects of this subgenre, since, quote, all phallic symbols are not equal, and a hands-on knifing answers a hands-on rape in a way that shooting, even a shooting preceded by a humiliation, does not, end quote. So the act of stabbing mimics the penetration act, and as such, it can be read as a visual representation of rape, since it is violent and an unwelcome act. These slashers penetrate their victims to establish their power. The fact that the most vicious stabbings in these films are to young women, right? There's a hyper focus on violence against young women, further solidifies this interpretation of the phallus and penetration. In The Wailer, we have the traditional elements of the slashers. The killer is a product of a bad family dynamic. She was murdered by her husband after killing her children. She is a disillusioned mother and lover. The location is not home, since the travelers are in Mexico, so definitely a terrible place, right? Quote unquote. And the weapon is her long nails. I'll add briefly here on the idea of the terrible place that Carol Clover talks about in relation to slashers. Many slasher films take place in suburbia or adjacent places such as lakes, camps, and things like that. These spaces are usually represented as primarily white, with a few disposable characters of color in the outskirts. The movies produced in the late 70s and early 80s clearly reflected the process of redlining and gentrification, or white flight, many cities were experiencing post-World War II. After World War II, with things like the GI Bill, white families were able to move out of cities and create or recreate segregated spaces. Horror films in the 70s and 80s reflected the fear of the unknown known, right? What happens when we're in this safe suburban space? What does the other look like? So movies like Stepford Wives, Last House on the Left, Poltergeist address these issues of what's buried under these safe spaces, what's hidden behind normalcy. So the fear becomes that people that look like your neighbors, that look like you, no longer might not be safe, right? They might be the horror. So the horror was no longer in a faraway land, but here at home, particularly white homes. This cultural milieu gave birth to the slasher, where the killer could come from our very own family. It could be our son, our neighbor, someone that works with our kids, right? Left out of this equation were people of color, except for the notable example of Candyman, which is a slasher, but a very different urban context to it. In the case of the film The Wailer, La Llorona is not afforded the luxury of existing in suburbia. She is twice removed. She is situated outside of the country, so we're not even in the US anymore, right? We're in Mexico, and she's situated in a rural space. They had to drive for like 40 minutes. It seemed like a really long drive to get to this particular cabin, so there's nothing else around. So it's definitely outside of the white picket fence dream. Thus, her otherness and the terribleness of this terrible place she inhabits are overdetermined to remind us how far removed she is from whiteness. So even before she became La Llorona, she was already monstrous. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the other component of the slasher is the way they kill, the stabbing and slashing. The first murder in The Wailer establishes these tropes of the tropes of the slasher film clearly. So when the college students arrive to the cabin, they start partying, drinking, making out. Everything is fine until in the middle of the night, the lights go out. So they're playing strip poker, and the lights go out, and Mike and Andrew decide to break into one of the rooms that Juan, the local that drove them to the cabin, told them not to go into. So there's one particular room they're not supposed to go into, and of course they break in. While they're doing that, Jay and Michelle go into a bedroom, and they decide to have sex. The first victim is here on the left, is Jay. He's the token Black character in the film. Up until this point, he's kind of served as comic relief. He says things like, VIP, that's how we roll, dog, you know what I'm saying, and I get your drink on. right? So there's against this hyper determination of their roles and the archetypes that we traditionally see in slasher movies. So Jay and Michelle are in the bedroom, and after the lights go out, and after deciding that, quote, weed made me horny, they have sex, and that's when La Llorona first attacks. So there's this double moment where as soon as they open the door, Jay is killed by La Llorona. When the others hear Michelle scream, Mike and Andrew break down the door to the room and see that Jake is on the floor covered in blood. So we have the slashes on his face and on his back. And when Michelle finally stops crying, she says it was her. She came out of the wall. So the mysterious her is La Llorona, who, after being awakened by the trespassers, has emerged from the house itself to kill them. Next slide, please. So Michelle, after Jake's death, runs to the bathroom and hides. There, the door jams and she screams for help, so she can't get out. And slowly, the Llorona comes out of the bathtub and attacks her. The camera focuses on her monstrous dark face and her long fingernails that threaten to penetrate Michelle. Her fingers are very phallic and also bring to mind the traditional slasher tools. So they're very similar to Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street. The sharp blades. In the case of La Llorona, in this scene, the nails could be read as a type of transgressive gender role, though. Long, well-manicured nails are usually associated with femininity. In the case of La Llorona, her long, deformed black nails question those standards of beauty. So it's a really interesting way to play with those standards of beauty and to make them something horrific. So the representation of La Llorona as slasher in the Wailer plays with traditional gender roles and is, in a way, represents her as a form of cross-dressing into the role of the traditional male slasher. However, La Llorona is objectified as sexual object in multiple scenes in the movie, which is highly unusual for the slasher genre, right? We rarely, never do characters comment on Krueger's hunky looks or Voorhees' muscle in the franchises Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, right? It's never quite that. In this film, however, La Llorona's looks, so how she looks, are pervasive visually, since there are constant shots of her before she drowned her children, and male characters ogle pictures of a woman in white that they find in the cabin. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, for example, when Mike and Andrew find a picture of her, they comment on her physique by stating that she was a hot bitch. So the image that they find is actually the image here on the left of this woman in a white dress drowning two children. So somehow this picture of the murder is in the cabin, and they don't notice the children. They just focus on her being hot and the fact that she's wearing white and there's water involved, right? So there's all these connotations with that. So before turning into the slasher, La Llorona is figured as a desirable object, and the film constantly reminds the viewer of the fact through the constant focus on this particular picture of her. This positioning of La Llorona questions how we see slasher films and how we see the slasher her himself. Clover claims that the slasher, who is typically male, is constructed as feminine because either his sexuality or virility is questioned. She explains that, quote, to the extent that the monster is constructed as feminine, the horror film thus expresses female desire only to show how monstrous it is. In the film, La Llorona's femininity and sexual availability are highlighted particularly by her objectification of the male gaze. This discourse is directed, though, to La Llorona's body before her transformation into the monster. As a slasher, La Llorona is covered in this like black tar. Her face is no longer clean and beautiful, but black with piercing yellow eyes. The only remaining familiar characteristic of her femininity are her monstrous nails and her dark curly hair, perhaps a reference to her mestiza identity. So this is one of the things that is enhanced after she turns into a monster. Her hair gets bigger and curlier. Next slide, please. So the film presents a foil to La Llorona's character. The heroine of this story is Julie. Here we see her throughout the movie. She is our final girl, so she is the virgin of the group because even though she does have a boyfriend, she restrains herself from being overtly sexual. She kisses Andrew, but compared to the other female characters, Ashley and Michelle, Julie is the good girl. She's the one that's, studies in school, that sort of stuff. She is good because she worries about her grades, her family, and has a boyfriend who is also good and caring. So they are the couple that makes it to the end of the movie. She is also the most white presenting in the movie. The other two women are ambiguously racialized as Latinas or mixed race. Clover explains that the relationship between the final girl and the slasher is complex since they have, quote, shared masculinity materialized in all those phallic symbols, and is also a shared femininity materialized in what comes next, the castration, literal or symbolic, of the killer at her hands. The final girl in Clover's work is the heroine who makes it to the end of the film only to come face to face with the monster. In the end, it is up to her and sometimes another person to kill this monster. The final girl's castration of the monster is necessary in order for the acceptable gender norms to prevail, since in castrating the monster, she is also placing herself in the masculine source of power. So at the end of the movie, we kind of have this reinstatement of the status quo. The final girl, Julie, in The Wailer problematizes these rules of horror because her confrontation with the slasher, La Llorona, does not turn out as expected. As the final showdown with La Llorona, Julie wakes up on the porch with the light of day hitting her face. So she wakes up, she's crying over Andrew, her boyfriend, who's dead, and she seems to be the only survivor. Then at this point, we still don't see her face. We only see the back. And we see she's covered in blood, and she's walking towards Juan, who's there to pick them up. And Juan starts shooting at her and runs away. When she looks in the side mirror of the car, and sees her face. The audience discovers along with her. So now we're seeing things through her eyes, right? We discover it when she does the truth. So she is no longer Julie, but is this mixed body. Half her face belongs to La Llorona. So the possessed half of her face has that black like tar that we had seen earlier. And she has this final scream when she realizes who she has become. So she survived the night, but only because La Llorona wanted this vessel, right? So in the case of The Wailer, the victim does not defeat the other, but is merged with it. So she becomes this monstrous Llorona. Julie is consumed physically and then psychologically by La Llorona. This ending allows a questioning of gender norms, since La Llorona, the feminine, was not defeated, but instead was able to incorporate herself in the stereotypical Julie. So in this slasher, the final girl does not defeat the monster that is disturbing the balance between bad and good, but is rather merged with this monster. This merging created a new Llorona that incorporates different identities. So we have La Llorona from the past and now Julie forming one new monster. Next slide, please. So in the Wailer, La Llorona is portrayed as a monstrous other who should be feared and that kills those that have trespassed onto her territory. The ending is particularly important since Julie, or the final girl, does not win in her attempt to metaphorically castrate the slasher Llorona. On the contrary, it is the feminine Llorona that succeeds in creating a new entity through Julie. By leaving the ending as a cliffhanger, the filmmakers have left a space open to further question gender and the portrayal of La Llorona and Latinos in horror. So it is now a trilogy, and we see the development. In the second movie, it's more of an exorcist movie where Julie's father goes to Mexico to look for her and then try to exorcise La Llorona out of her. So the series switches from horror subgenres throughout. So thank you very much.
All right, so Orquidea, thank you so much for that very fascinating paper. I know I made a lot of notes about this. So now we're going to hand over, and I'm really glad to introduce Morten Feldtfos Thomsen, senior lecturer from the department. Yeah, he is a senior lecturer with the Department of Comparative Literature at Karlstad University in Sweden. His primary field of interest is the interaction of literature with other media, and his doctoral dissertation traces the manifestation of various intermedial strategies in novels by John DeLillo and Klaus Beck-Nielsen. He has recently published an article in Horror Studies investigating monstrous intermediality in the Babadook, and is currently working on research projects concerning Scandinavian slasher cinema and serial killer narratives. He is also a member of the research group for culture studies at Karlstad University. So take it away, Morten. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll see if I can share my screen. Okay, so I hope everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation. So my paper today is titled Class, Community, and Carnage, the Swedish Teen Slasher. Despite its prominence in horror cinema, the teen slasher's impact in Sweden has been relatively limited. Since the release of 1983's The Bleeder, in fact, as far as I know, only 3 other films have followed: Camp Slaughter and Drowning Ghost in 2004, and Death Academy in 2005. But rather than speculate upon the possible explanations for this seeming lack of interest, what I want to do here today is to explore a selection of the few examples that do exist. My main argument is that Swedish filmmakers have employed the conventions of the teen slasher in order to engage with issues relating to the concept of the welfare state and the ideals of social justice and economical and political equality associated with it. My focus will be on The Bleeder and Drowning Ghost. But all of the films mentioned explore a collapse or a kind of disruption of the welfare state ideal, while also offering different interpretations of and paths, possible paths beyond this crisis. The Bleeder centers on a female rock band whose tour bus breaks down in the middle of nowhere. And searching for help in the surrounding woods, the band stumbles upon a seemingly abandoned village whose only inhabitant is a sort of a childlike man who suffers from a severe case of hemophilia, begins stalking and killing them. It's a very basic plot. From the outset, the theme of class is present, as the film's prologue tells the tragic backstory of a working class woman raped many years earlier by a member of the landowning elite, resulting in the birth of a sickly boy who was subsequently left to fend for himself after his mother committed suicide. It is implied, of course, that this boy grew up to become the film's titular killer. And the violent events portrayed in the film are thereby framed not necessarily as the result of individual pathology or abstract notions of evil, but as the result of social and historical circumstance, in this case, the violent transgression of one class against another. Within this context, the female band members work as symbolic representatives of 1980s teenage Sweden, which is, of course, also part of the film's implicit audience. The portrayal of this generation is far from valorizing. The protagonists spend the majority of their time talking about boys and gossiping about, talking about celebrity culture and other topics of popular culture, and are seemingly more preoccupied with that type of with such matters than with dealing with the situation at hand. They frequently argue amongst themselves and complain about being bored and hungry, even as people around them are disappearing. So in every regard, they are portrayed not as individuals on the verge of adulthood, but as petulant children, not entirely without blame in their own grisly demise. The Bleeder in this way does not really feature a typical final girl, but instead valorizes male state-sanctioned authority in the figure of a forest ranger who ultimately saves the only surviving protagonist and defeats, at least seemingly so, the killer. Only those who ultimately disregard childish preoccupations and lean on the proper male authorities for help, so the film seems to suggest, will be able to survive. And the film's image of 1980s teenage Sweden is that of a generation so caught up in inconsequential consumption that they are entirely unaware of the dangerous circumstances in which they find themselves. The film suggests a complete lack of community and caring among the teenage protagonists, who instead come across as sort of almost malignantly narcissistic.
Morten, sorry to interrupt. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Unfortunately, your slideshow is not in presentation mode. Sorry, would you be able to close it and reopen it? My apologies for this. Okay, there we go. It's gone to the right slide.
Does this work?
Yeah, it's on the correct slide now, but it's not in presentation mode.
Okay.
See if that works. No, it's still on the full. It's gone now.
Maybe this will work.
Let's try this. There we go. Yes, that's it. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure.
Thanks for helping out.
No problem.
Okay. Let me just find where I left off. Yes, okay. Slide 7, which you should be seeing now, hopefully. So this portrayal of the teenage protagonists also establishes a link between the protagonists and the killer. As mentioned, the killer comes across as distinctly childlike, and many of his actions and mannerisms suggest that his mental state is that, at least to some degree, that of a toddler. And this portrayal of the killer establishes a kind of mirroring effect, where the childish behavior of the teenage protagonists is mirrored in his behavior to some extent, just as the killer's mental infantilism, if you follow the logic of the film, is coded as dangerous, so too is the infantilism of the teenage protagonists. Because of this, it ultimately takes the male adult authority figure to save the day. In stylistic terms, objective third-person perspective dominates, and point-of-view shots are used only sparingly, which is illustrative of the film's resistance to placing the viewer in situations too uncomfortable. There are almost no explicit on-screen depictions of violence. Rather, a majority of the attacks end with the killer dragging his victims off-screen with physical violence suggested by a sound. The only instances of on-screen violence feature the killer sort of grabbing his victims and choking them until they are unconscious. However, all of these scenes are presented in a manner so unrealistic that they come across almost comical. Curiously, for a slasher, furthermore, there are no instances of the killer using knives or the slashing or stabbing weapons. In one telling instance, in fact, the killer does pick up a knife, only to throw it away shortly before grabbing his victim. Ultimately, therefore, the film the bleeder comes across as reactionary in the way that it condemns its teenage protagonists as ignorant narcissists, while valorizing male authority and rejecting many, if not all, of the stylistic strategies of the sort of the classical teen slasher formula. And while its backstory does gesture towards themes concerning class struggle and social and economic equality, and other themes as well, but it does so in order to position the teenage protagonists as entirely incapable of addressing such issues in any meaningful fashion. So if there is anything to fight for in social and political terms within the framework of the film, clearly teenagers cannot be trusted to accomplish much. Similar thematic threads are evident in Drum and Ghost, which features it's a sort of a whodunit plot, and it features a masked murderer stalking and killing the students of a boarding school. In previous times, the school was the province of the rich and powerful. Social reform, however, has made the student body more economically diverse, and much of the film's narrative centers on conflicts between students belonging to the old economic elite and the newcomers belonging to the middle and working classes. The film's main teenage protagonist, Sarah, is in the process of writing an essay about past tragedies at the school, and much of the film focuses on her gradual uncovering of a series of violent abuses of power by school officials as well as local authorities. Abuses most often motivated by the need to protect those in power from being held accountable for their transgressions against the less privileged and powerful. The viewer is strongly led to assume that these past tragedies are in some way connected to the present killings. This turns out to be a red herring, however, and the killer is ultimately revealed to be the brother of a girl who committed suicide the previous year, and the murders are cast as revenge against those students whose bullying, he believes, led to her death. But while unrelated in narrative terms, strictly speaking, the past violations uncovered by Sarah and the killer's quest for revenge work in tandem to foreground the interconnected themes of class conflict and corrupt institutional authority. A link between past and present is thereby established, suggesting that past hierarchies of power and privilege persist, and that the ideals of justice and equality, so central to the Swedish concept of the welfare state, remain unrealized. As was the case with the Bleeder, the killer in Drowning Ghosts similarly figures less as the result of individual pathology and more as a kind of symptom of economic, social, and political inequality. In this context, the figure of Sarah becomes a symbol for the possibility of change and progress through the uncovering of social injustices. And she becomes a cipher for a kind of youth rebellion against corrupt adult institutional authority. Unlike the Bleeder, therefore, Drowning Ghosts seems intent on offering a sense of empowerment and positivity to its ostensibly teenage audience. And in direct contrast to the Bleeder, it casts the generation of early 2000s Swedish teens as the catalysts of social change and progress. Like the Bleeder, Drowning Ghost resists many of the traditional stylistic features associated with the teen slasher. Subjective point of view, for instance, is used extremely sparingly, and in relation to depictions of violence, specifically, killer point of view is not employed at all. There is actually only a single case of the so-called killer point of view in the film, and it is used in an entirely non-violent context. In other instances, the camera work suggests through movement and placement a perspective which might reasonably be associated with the perspective of an introdiegetic character, only to reveal that it is in fact an objective third-person perspective, not aligned with any single character. on several occasions. For instance, a perspective which at first seems to belong to that of the killer turns out to be a third-person perspective. In this way, the camera work suggests alignment, but always rejects it. In fact, you could say that it sort of stages a form of rejection, thereby avoiding aligning the viewer with the perspective of the killer, but in fact instead aligning it briefly with the victim. So here is a shot where you can see there's a shot which initially seems to belong to the killer, but then the killer walks into frame. This is just one example. So although it gestures towards placing the viewer in a position which might allow the viewer to partake in the killer's revenge, however, it avoids doing so. And instead, in those moments when revenge is realized through violence, the perspective shifts to that of the victim, suggesting that revenge, no matter how seemingly justified, is always morally suspect. While the film thus valorizes Sarah's quest for justice and her battle against corrupt adult authority, it rejects the killer's quest for revenge. This rejection is established not only in narrative terms, but also in stylistic terms, through this rejection of alignment with the killer's perspective. We are invited through the narrative to understand and to some degree sympathize with the killer's motives, but we are not made to adopt his point of view in regards to the means through which he seeks to redress injustice. As such, the film resists this, resists ideological alignment, I would say, with the killer's revenge motive, but remains loyal to the perspective of Sarah and her non-violent quest for justice. So there you have it. This is something approaching a kind of victim POV in that scene. Unlike The Bleeder, Drowning Ghost emphasizes community, moral integrity, and fighting for justice as something of which contemporary Swedish teenagers are capable. Unlike The Bleeder's damning portrayal of its teenage protagonists, Drowning Ghost presents its final girl, as well as several other characters, as representatives of a generation of teenagers capable of resisting old hierarchies of injustice and inequality and fighting for justice and community in the face of a corrupt economic adult elite. It is a film which ultimately, which is also sort of suggested in the final scenes of the film, it sort of celebrates its teenage audience and its potential for creating a social and political change. So although The Bleeder and Drowning Ghost share similar thematic concerns and stylistic traits, they differ markedly in their response to the problems of social, political, and economic inequality. In The Bleeder, as mentioned, teenagers are viewed as childish, ignorant narcissists, incapable of creating any form of social and political change, and instead dependent upon institutional male authority. Drowning Ghost instead positions its teenage audience as capable of fighting the powers that be, and thereby leading the charge for a more equal and just society. Indeed, you could say that Drowning Ghost criticizes precisely what The Bleeder glorifies, namely a kind of patriarchal capitalism. In any case, both films are, I think, interesting examples of how the narrative and stylistic framework of the teen slasher has been used by Swedish filmmakers to engage with issues relating specifically to Sweden's social and political life, both past and present. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for both papers. Both have been incredibly interesting and illuminating. I was just monitoring the chat for some, but I will just go ahead and ask some questions. That's all right. first, before I had it kind of pinned in the back of my head while you were talking, Morten, about these different instances of representing youth in a certain way, and this sort of turn that happens right from one film to the other. And I was wondering, and I mean, maybe it's a little bit of a, let's say, of something that was in the background. I was thinking about this proclivity of being restrained and portraying teenagers in a fashion that is much more akin to the US slasher in The Bleeder. So I was wondering how much of it, and I mean, I don't know if it had anything to do with it, could be restrained with this desire of not being censored or cut, because it seems to me that it was around the time where there was this huge controversy in Sweden about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and all these shows were being like exploited on TV about how bad of an influence it was on the youth. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in that period in the 1980s, there was the so-called video violence debate in Sweden, in which Scandinavia, sort of an extension of the video nasties debate in Great Britain. That might have been a factor, absolutely, in terms of this kind of restraint in relation to graphic depictions of violence. There are other possible explanations as well. I think historically, in the Scandinavian countries, there's a pretty strong tradition of censorship in relation to depictions of graphic violence, and it's also, I think, culturally considered not quite proper cinema, so to speak. So there are a variety of factors. Interestingly enough, I mean, the Bleeder was not a theatrical release. It was made for VHS market. I have yet to look into the matter in any great detail, but that would lead me to believe that there was at least no official censorship involved. I don't think the VHS market at that point was particularly regulated, at least in Sweden. I may be wrong, but I'm developing these analyses at present, and I will be looking in more detail to sort of the that type of context. In regards to Drowning Ghost, it's interesting. Drowning Ghost was actually released theatrically and was made by a director, which Mikael Hafström, who had the script lying around for a long time and couldn't get it made. Only after the success of his film Ondskan, I think it's probably translated into Evil, which was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Feature. And that was kind of a big deal. So he became a big deal in Sweden, and then he got to make his slasher film. But even so, it's a very stylish slasher. It has sort of, in certain ways, it's kind of reminiscent of Giallo in certain sense. But also there again, I think the restraint in the depiction of violence. There are many possible explanations, yeah. But it's interesting that they share this feature. The other examples, it's quite different. But maybe we can talk about that some other time.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I look forward to also, reading a little bit more about how this idiosyncrasy that has to do with the proper restraint of the Swede to not be conveyed in excess. And I mean, I think it's also, being a social-cultural situation there. But thank you so much for illuminating that. We have a question for Orquidea. And Bruna asks, what do you think about the 2019 film La Llorona? And does the film bring anything to your research? So I'm unsure if it's the one that came with The Conjuring or La Llorona by Jario Bustamante. So
that's what I was gonna ask too. So what's really fascinating is the one with The Conjuring is very much that desire, and it was very clear from the very beginning. It kind of felt like Paranormal Activity, the marked ones. This is the Latino version, right? This is for Latinos, about Latinos, with a white woman in the lead sort of situation. But it was definitely created and marketed to that audience, with an understanding that this audience is really supporting the Conjuring franchise and a lot of horror films. So I was not a fan at all of the 2019 US version that Michael Chavez directed. It's an interesting movie, and it had a lot of possibilities because they brought in a curandero who's like a healer, and they used him as a way to understand the history of La Llorona, and they provided different folk remedies. So they had the eye, like the evil eye and things like that. But it wasn't fully developed, right? It all felt very forced. The Jairo Bustamante one from Guatemala, that's a completely different story. That movie is very much about kind of what a lot of like particularly women have been doing with the image of La Llorona, using La Llorona as a way to make political commentary. And he talked about using La Llorona and horror genre specifically as a way to talk about the violence and the dictatorship in Guatemala and all the missing indigenous peoples and murdered indigenous peoples through horror, because it was a genre that wasn't policed in the same ways as dramas, right? So it's a way to talk about these topics without getting censored, without, being disappeared like other people have been. But it's also a genre that people go to. So he's like, I did some research. A lot of Guatemalans go see horror movies or superhero movies. I wasn't going to make a superhero movie. So I made a horror movie using the image of La Llorona to talk about these disappearances and this genocide of indigenous communities in Guatemala. And even then, the movie, he's talked about how they had to film in various embassies, like the French embassy in Guatemala, because they were worried for their safety. So yeah, I highly recommend the Llorona by Jairo Bustamante. The other one is an interesting piece and really helpful in thinking about how Latinos are targeted or marketed to in the US, but it's not a good horror movie. So that's kind of how I see both of them.
And that brings me a great deal to what you discussed in your paper, that I think we also sort of keep coming back to this really valuable pointer about the underrepresentation of Latinos in their specificity. Also, so I would like to maybe frame my question or dig a little bit into your thoughts about this idea of Latinidad, this undifferentiated notion where you have, for me personally, that was one of the pitfalls of La Llorona from The Conjuring, because it was this undifferentiated idea of Mexicanness as this overall narrative about what Latinidad is. So where do you stand on this?
So what we see happen, the first Llorona movie and the first horror movie in Mexico that came out in 1933 was all about indigeneity and Mexico grappling with its national identity and its history of conquest and its history of displacing indigenous peoples and then identifying as mestizo, right? We're all equal because we're all mixed race, we're all mestizos, so there's no racism in Mexico. And this horror movie was used as a way to kind of think through those things, and it was fairly early on in the golden age of Mexican cinema. So it kind of sets those standards that we see in other productions of La Llorona in Mexico. But then when we move to the US, the national context is so different because La Llorona is not a symbol of Mexican national identity. She's a symbol of Latinidad, period, right? And that means it's a representation of Latin American and Latinos in the US, which there's a distinction. But in this monstrous figure, it's a conglomerate of all these other, right? Everything that we fear that's not quite part of the US national identity, that's never going to integrate, that's always going to be outside of the boundaries of normalcy. And it is through the monstrous figure of La Llorona that we see this. So it's still about national identity. It's just, it's about protecting US whiteness, right? And keeping at bay Latin American and Latino identity. But I think that's the issue with representation, right? When we have one representation, we want it to mean so much. We want it to all want to identify with it, and that's impossible. And we can think about how that happened within the Heights, but that's like a tangent, right? How a lot of people were rightfully mad that there weren't representations of Afro-Latinos. And it's like, if there's just one movie that's by Latinos with the representation of Latinos, then that's the problem. It just, the weight of representation is impossible. So yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I think those are just like as a closing note, I think a reflection that really draws so much from both papers. Thank you so much. This idea of how is that these contexts are represented in their specificity and what they can offer. So it brings so many other connections, and unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you so much for your brilliant papers, and I really look forward to reading more about how they develop.
Yes, thank you, Orquidea and Morten, and thank you, Valeria, for your participation and sharing. It's you know, very interesting and lively conversation. Right. It's time for another break. We've got 30 minutes, and we'll be back at 6 o'clock with our first keynote of the conference with Dr. Steve Jones, who will be talking about the metamodern slasher. So yes, please do come. Don't forget, as a big thank you to the keynotes, we have set up a money pool with PayPal. It should be in the conference packet and on the web on our Twitter page and the website about how to donate to that if you want to contribute to that. But yes, in the meantime, take a 30-minute break. Be back here at 6 for more of the conference and to hear from Dr. Steve Jones. Thank you.